with the scribes. We saw also here the selection of the 12 that Jesus made, of the 12 apostles. And then we begun to then look at, there's a contrast that we're really going to be looking at beginning this morning. Right here at the very end of chapter 3, as we finish up chapter 3, there's inserted here just it's an event. It's something that happens that almost seems like, what's the point? Why is this needed here? And it's just a discussion about Jesus and his family, really. Beginning in verse 31, says, "Then his mother and his brothers arrived, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, 'Behold, your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you.' And answering them, he said, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking about at those who were sitting around him, he said, 'Behold, my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother.'" Now, why is this passage so important to Mark's message? Everything that we've seen from the message of Mark, of what he's portraying concerning God and his plan and Christ and his plan, why is this so important? Well, how does this connect? Do you see any connections with what has just been happening here in chapter 3 and why God felt that this is necessary to insert this right here? Any thoughts? Okay. Jesus is here for all people. Everybody has access to Jesus. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Okay, so Jesus is not focused on the things of this world. Jesus is focused on, and he's going to teach it. He's going to teach it over and over again. Do not store up for yourselves treasures here on earth, but in heaven. He's going to say later on to his disciples, he say, if you do not hate mother and brother and father and sister and follow me, then you can't be a disciple of mine. And we talk about that all the time. He's not talking about hating them as in despising them, but it's the priority that you place them in your life. If anything or anyone comes above Christ, we've got it wrong. And so Jesus, he is actually exemplifying that here. He's showing us an example of who really is most important in the life of Jesus, even while Jesus was here on earth. Yeah, Brent? Okay, and that's perfect, because always look to see what has just happened. Jesus just got done talking about a kingdom divided cannot stand, a house divided cannot stand. And now he's pointing towards what really is the house that is most important. And so, yes, it's talking about his physical family here, his mother and his brothers as they have come. But Jesus is trying to help them to see that those who are willing to do the will of God are the ones that are the closest to him. And so those that are willing to obey, and it's not working. Sean, check my connection on the... But those who are doing the will, you see in verse 35, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. So those that are while Jesus was here on earth, let me ask this. What role did Jesus play while he was here on earth? What role did he play in the kingdom? Thanks. Was he king? What? He was a servant. In a kingdom, you have two people. You have royalty and you have the subjects. While Jesus was here on earth, he was a subject in the kingdom. Now, how do we know that? What's some evidence that Jesus was not king at the time? That he was not the supreme authority himself while he was a human being here on earth? What evidence do we have of that? Okay, we see him washing the feet of other people, proving himself to be a servant. Okay, there were certain limits that Jesus shows that he had when it came to deity. We know that Jesus is God. We know that he is the Word, and the Word has been with God, and the Word was God. But what happened with Jesus, Philippians chapter 2, as he came to this earth, he emptied himself of, we don't know, there's no way for us to understand exactly what all is involved in that. But he emptied himself of some of that divinity that he had as being God. He still is God as the Son of God, but he has placed himself as a servant, a bondservant. He's volunteered to be the servant. That's what the idea of a bondservant is. And then we also have places like here in Mark 14 verse 36, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. What does Jesus say to his Father in the garden? Not my will, but yours be done. Jesus is demonstrating that he is a subject in the kingdom under the authority of his Father. Now that's going to change because we're going to see in Matthew 28 that Jesus says after his death, burial, and resurrection, he's going to say then, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Then Jesus is king. Jesus is the Lord of lords. He is the King of kings. But while he's here on this earth, he's a part of the family. He's looking to them, and we're not just talking about the physical family. Jesus, I think we have to note, his authority, even while he was here on earth, his authority was still elevated above ours. Because you have the son of a king. So if you go to, there's not a whole lot of monarchies that really work that way anymore, but go to England. There are still sons of the queen, right? They still have authority over most people, but they do not have all authority. Their authority is still elevated above everybody else, but they do not have the supreme authority. And that's really the role that Jesus as the Son of the King, as the Son of God, was while he was here on earth. He's still God. He's still a Son of God. He's still in the family of God. But his authority, he gave up some of that authority when he came to the earth. And so now we're talking about this family that Jesus is looking to as a family. Here in Mark chapter 3, he's speaking to the Jews. And so these Jews are still being under the law of Moses. And so he's making a contrast here from what we just saw with the scribes, Jews that are under the law of Moses who are not submitting to the will of God. And he says, now let me explain to you what is my true family? My true family are the ones who are willing to humble themselves and do the will of God. That's who true family is. And so the same is true for us today. We call each other brothers and sisters in Christ. It's biblical for us to do so. But what makes us brothers and sisters in Christ? Okay. All right. Some answer is, well, the blood of Christ, and that's what makes us all brothers and sisters. However, the blood of Christ by itself did not make us a family. It's not until I decide that I am going to submit to the will of God. When I submit to the will of God, and you submit to the will of God, and you submit to the will of God, now we are family. Now we're brothers and sisters in Christ. And that's what Jesus is trying to show them. There's a contrast that he's using here between, you see what the scribes are doing? They will not submit to the will of God. They are not family. They're not the family of God. They're Jews. They're the chosen race of people that God had used through the centuries to bring about his plan, but they were not doing the will of God. Therefore, Jesus is making a point. They're not family. And even his brothers, at one point, we'll see later on, there's a point they didn't believe in Jesus. They didn't believe everything about him. And so there's going to be that contrast. They were not, doesn't seem to be doing all of the will of God and believing and trusting and having faith in Jesus, at least up to some point. And so Jesus is making that contrast to help the people to see that and know that. Now notice here in verse 35 as well, Jesus doesn't say, whoever does the will of my Father. Wouldn't this be the perfect place for Jesus to point out that he was the Son of God? But it's not time for that yet. He still is referring, it's the will of God. He still has not connected himself to being the Son of God yet. The only one who's said that so far in the Gospel of Mark is who? A demon. That's the only one who's made that statement so far. And what did Jesus tell that demon? Be quiet. It's not time for that information to come out yet. It's true, but Jesus still is here, and he's still making sure that his plan, God's plan, is going to work the way that it needs to before all of that gets stirred up in the end. Okay, chapter 4. Chapter 4, first couple of verses. Again, ignore the big number 4 on your page. Because it has nothing to do with, now there is, it does show that because where they've divided this, it seems like there's kind of a new event taking place, but it's connected to what just happened in chapter 3. So don't ever forget that. One of the best, if you want to just read through, and I don't know how many are still reading through the Gospel of Mark every week. I said that at the very beginning of this study, and I had a couple of people come to me after several weeks and say, I've never done this before. This is amazing. It's pretty amazing what you start to see coming out when you're continuously reading over it over and over and over again. And so if you're not continuing to do that, then try to do that throughout the week. Read through the Gospel of Mark because you're going to start seeing things that we haven't got to yet. You're going to be able, wow, that connects all the way back here to this. And it's really cool when you start to be able to see all that. But if you're able to print out a book of the Bible on your computer, if you have a program, or if you don't, find somebody that does, and have them delete all of the numbers, it will change the way that you see the text. Because even though we talk about it, ignore that big number 4, we can't. It's hard to see that it's not there. And it makes it harder for us to see the connections between chapters a lot of times. And so if you're able to do that, I would recommend doing that as you're reading through it. Okay, in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, says he began to teach again by the sea. And such a very large crowd gathered to him that he got into the boat in the sea and sat down. And the whole crowd was by the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables and was saying to them in his teaching, I'll stop there for a sec. The emphasis again is placed here on the masses of people. There's really not any time, unless it specifically says Jesus went away to be by himself. I want you to constantly just have in your mind that Jesus is all the time surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of people. It's in his own home where he can't even eat. It's everywhere. He's here by the shore, and he has to get into a boat to get away from the people so that he can teach. And it's just, that picture is just something that helps me to really see what was going on around Jesus at the time. But it mentions here that he was teaching them many things in parables. The word parable, what does the word parable mean? Oh, yeah, Sam? Yeah. Yeah. And that's one thing that's amazing about water, is I think Jesus understood that, being the creator of water, of how water becomes an amplifier. It becomes a PA system. And I've heard a lot of preachers who have traveled over to the Sea of Galilee, who have been able to step into a boat and be able to preach from a boat, and that's one of my dreams, of preaching in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. But it's to see and imagine the crowds of people that are constantly surrounding Jesus is a pretty amazing thing. He's teaching in parables. What is a parable? Define parable. What is a parable? An earthly story with a spiritual meaning. Okay, it's very good. Anything else? That sums up a lot of it. Mm-hmm. Okay, and what's the value of using something that's so familiar to you and trying to teach something that's harder to understand? What's the value of that? Okay, so by simplifying it, we can see a picture, that's something we do understand, and realize, oh, he's making a comparison to this over here that's hard to understand, but now I get it because of what it says. What else is another reason? Okay. So this is the parable of a man went out and scattered seed. There is an application in that, there is a need to be scattering seed. Now, how that seed is scattered and that type of thing it's very general, but there's an application, there's a point to that. Why else? What is another benefit of using pictures like this to teach? Okay. To see the connection between those things. It's easier to remember. You're an artist, aren't you? Most people that are right-brained, that's the first thing they think of. People who are very artsy. When they think of pictures and they think about parables, that's one of the first things that they talk about is it helps me to remember the other teaching, because I'm going to remember the image that Jesus paints in my head from the parable. And so these are all reasons why Jesus uses these. And there's more we'll talk about in just a minute. But literally, the word parable means to lay alongside of. That's what the word literally means, the Greek word that's used there. It's taking an illustration and laying it alongside the teaching, the doctrinal, biblical, deeper teaching, so that they both agree with each other and complement each other. And so, if you ever hear any type of an application to a parable that it doesn't go with the picture, then you know there's a problem. And there's a lot of people, who try to dig a lot of doctrinal things out of parables that were never intended by the parable. You have to keep it in context to make sure that you are applying it to the right thing. And that's why we want to make, what did we just talk about in chapter 3? What's he going to be talking about in chapter 4? And that's what these parables are going to be dealing with. We've got to keep them in those contexts. So, let's see. Let's go ahead and read this, beginning in verse 3. He says, "Listen to this. Behold, the sower went out to sow. And as he was sowing, some seed fell beside the road, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on the rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up because it had no depth of soil. And after the sun had risen, it was scorched. Because it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and thorns came up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. Other seeds fell into good soil, and as they grew up and increased, they yielded a crop and produced 30, 60, and 100-fold. And so there's the parable that Jesus tells. Well, verse 9, and he was saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay, after the encounter with Jesus discussing that his true family are the ones who are doing the will of God, he then moves into this teaching using this parable, the seed being cast out and planted in the soil. Now, is this teaching then, is it really going to be about a farmer and planting seed? Is that the point he's trying to make? No, it's a parable. And so this whole thing has been about the types of hearts of people. That's what the whole thing we've been seeing in chapter 3, it's been about. The hearts of the scribes. They're hard. They don't care what they see Jesus doing. They don't care that they just saw him heal the man with the withered hand. They have hard hearts. So when the seed that Jesus is casting out there to plant into their hearts, it's just landing on the surface and it's being removed. The birds are coming and eating it and taking it away. It's never planted into, and we're not going to get into a whole lot right now of the description of the parable because Jesus is going to define it all for us. But Jesus, using these most familiar events to teach these aspects of faith, the people that are living at this time, every single one of them has seen a man or woman out in a field casting seed. It's just what people did. It was part of life, everyday life. There wasn't so much city life and not city life back then. Even when you're in the city, you're still involved with a lot of the rural things that are going on. And so this is something everybody's familiar with. It's a picture they can imagine in their head because they've been walking down the road and seen a farmer in his field over with a bag hanging around his neck and dipping his hand into that and casting it out across the field in the soil. Everybody's seen it. So the picture now is ingrained in their head, and that's what Jesus is trying to get them to see. They've been walking along the road, and they've seen where the farmer kind of missed and landed on the road, and they've seen the birds that have stopped to pick it up and eat it. They've seen all of these things, so it's helping to make the message stick. But Jesus he's trying to get them to see why different people have different kinds of hearts. That's what the message is going to be. He's trying to help them. Here's the scribes and Pharisees over here. They're supposed to be the leaders. They're supposed to be the ones who are guiding you in truth, but because of their hearts. And he's going to describe why, what the reason behind that is. And really, according to what we've just seen, what makes one heart different than another? What truly makes one heart different than another? What makes one person like the scribes and one person like the apostles? What's the difference? Open mind, closed mind, okay? It's whether or not one is willing to listen or not. And that's exactly what Jesus is just saying right here. What does he say at the beginning of verse 3? What's the very first word? Listen to this. So, in verse 3, he starts with, listen to this. At the end of this, how does he conclude verse 9? He who has ears to hear, let him hear. These are bookends. Jesus has just placed bookends on this text so that he has a starting place and an ending place. Listen, and then are you listening? Is basically what he's doing here. And so everything in between is going to be about this. The word listen is the word akuo. It's the word usually translated here. It's the same word that we have down in verse 9 for hear, but here it's listen. The word akuo, we've seen it one other time in the text so far. It's not just hearing the sounds. Akuo has attached to it, it's listening with an intent to do what you've heard. That is, it's built into the word that's used here. The root word is akuo. And so whenever we see this word akuo for listen or hear, it's not just, well, what do we do as parents? As parents, we tell our children to do something and they don't do it. What do we usually say? You're not listening to me. Listening has an expectation of obedience. And that's what is built into the word akuo. And so you can hear what I'm saying, or are you really listening? And it's easy for a parent to know if their children are listening when they walk into their bedroom or the bathroom or kitchen or someplace and they see, is what I said done or not? And if not, they might have heard, but they didn't listen. And that's what Jesus is trying to get across here. There are people who hear. The scribes, they were hearing everything that Jesus was saying, but they were not listening. They were not akuoing. That's kind of not fair to do with the Greek word. But it's they were not putting it into practice. So when we pay attention to, if you pay attention to when you hear Jesus use this phrase, the phrase in verse 9, he who has ears, let him hear. This is going to be a common phrase. I mean, it's not used a whole lot, but here in Mark, it's used 3 other times. We'll see it again in verse 23. You're going to see it in chapter 7 and verse 16. You're going to see it in chapter 8 and verse 26. And so I make note of that there next to verse 9. The other places you're going to find it. When we see this, it's because Jesus is saying, pay attention to what I'm saying. Listen to what I'm saying. He's really trying to get them to hone in and focus on what he's teaching. So, like I said, instead of dissecting this parable right here, we're going to let Jesus explain it when we get down to it. But this parable is going to kind of be a primer for all the other parables he's going to teach, because Jesus is going to go into detail and explain what every piece of this parable is. He's not going to do that very often. He's going to do it some, but he's not going to do it very often. And so this is the first real parable. He did tell a parable to the scribes earlier, but this is the first parable he's taught to his disciples. And so in doing this, what we're seeing is he's teaching them, this is how I'm expecting you to treat my parables when I use them. You're going to have to do some work and think about it. You're going to have to kind of chew on what I've said and analyze it and to understand exactly what I'm trying to get across. And so he's going to help them with this first one. You see here in verse 10, it says, as soon as he was alone, his followers, along with the 12, began asking him about the parables. How many in this room have been a teacher, whether it was in a school or a Bible class, or raise your hand if you have taught? Wow, we've got lots of teachers. That's pretty awesome. The best students in your class were the ones who did what the most? Ask the most questions. And the ones who are listening, that's always good. You really like the ones that are listening because you can see they're doing what I'm telling them to do. But there are a lot of kids that listen and do what you tell them to do that never really do excel, because whether it's they're too afraid or their pride gets in the way or something, they're not willing to ask questions. And so what we see here, Jesus' followers, true students, are going to ask questions. I love it, especially when there are new Christians and my phone is just blowing up at 2 a.m. with text messages and things like that. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Sierra, now that you walked in. I love it. When Sierra was, when she, and there are others in here too, I know I can use her, but the hunger that she had And the questions, and it was question after question after question after question after question after question after question. And it was kind of one of those things, a lot of people, you're just like, oh, good grief. I mean, come on. But I love it. It was so cool to watch because it is automatically a sign of somebody who is searching, somebody who wants to follow, somebody who wants to do what's right. I don't want to get this wrong. I want to get it right. And so they ask a lot of questions. And every teacher, this is not about you. I'm disconnecting my illustration now. The one who's asking a lot of questions may not be the smartest person in the room. They might be, but they might not be. But the one who is asking questions is the one who truly has the desire to want to know. And so I think it's interesting here that it points this out, that the disciples are asking questions. And so when we see this from others, there are some who are not going to want to do the work that's involved in Bible study. There are some that they want it handed to them. There's some that they're going to ask for somebody else, and this is something I'm guilty of. People ask questions, and it's even guilty. I think I was even guilty of it, even with conversation with Sierra and many others. That I'm saying, I go, oh, I know the answer to that. So here's the answer. And instead of what Jesus does, or what I've learned from Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, is he teaches them and he gives them part of the answer. And that's really what a parable is. But he gives them enough to be able to figure it out on their own. He kind of forces them to become a student instead of just a sponge. And I think that's something that's very important. What is it? Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. God has given gifts. He's given some as apostles, and some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. For what purpose? Why are there evangelists and pastors, or elders and teachers in the church today? Why did God design the church to have those in the church today? To equip the saints. That's the reason. And so a lot of times it's there are elders and there are leaders in the church that they do all of the work, and then they just spill it all out, and here's all of what I've discovered, instead of equipping the saints to do the work themselves. That's what a true disciple will do. And that's what Jesus does in his ministry. We see it over and over again where Jesus is challenging people, study it for yourself. I want to challenge you with something. And there's even a point in John chapter 6 where his teaching was so hard that a lot of people left. And Jesus turned to his own disciples and said, do you want to leave too? And because he wants to challenge them. God wants people who want him. And the people who truly want to belong to him. And that's what we begin to see here with his family are the ones who will do the will of God. And now immediately following that, we get into seeing those that truly are doing the will of God. They're seeking, they're searching for answers. And so we can learn a lot from what we see in what Jesus is doing here with the disciples in our own growth of knowledge as well. Okay, we'll pick up here. Well, I'll leave it at that. We'll pick up here in verse 11. The word mystery is used in verse 11. Look at the word mystery, not just here, but all through the New Testament. Do a little homework and see what that mystery really is referring to. What is Jesus talking about here when he talks about this mystery here in chapter 4 and verse 11?